British-Iran relations. Time limit is 1 hour. Lord ALTON of Liverpool.
My Lords, in fact, all member Lords who speak today, I begin by saying I wish more time was available for an extended parliamentary debate. I should also record, for the sake of transparency, that the Noble Lord Polak and I are both sanctioned by the Iranian regime. Key issues that the House will want the Minister to address will include Iran's reported ability to have enriched uranium to levels just short of the threshold for making a nuclear bomb. We'll want to hear about its supply of drones to Putin for his use in the illegal war in Ukraine, about its support for regional proxies destabilising the region, not least for the Houthis in Yemen, where an estimated 150,000 people have been killed in the war, including 10,000 children, about the malign activities of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard inside and outside of Iran, and the continued, lamentable, dismal failure to proscribe it, about abductions and extrajudicial killings, including of UK citizens, and the increasing use of the death penalty, about the decision this week of the Iran International Independent TV station to leave London because of threats to its staff, along with similar systematic targeting of BBC Persian staff and their families, about the shocking, ill-timed cuts to the BBC Persian services when there are widespread protests sweeping the country, heroically initiated by defiant women, and when the need for the flow of reliable news rather than propaganda has never been greater. And we'll hear about the systematic abuse of human rights, not least for political and religious beliefs, including Baha'is and Christians, whose beliefs don't conform to those of Iran's repressive theocratic regime. Turning first to the issue of nuclear proliferation, the inspectors for the International Atomic Energy Agency say levels of enriched uranium at Iran's nuclear sites are now just 6% below the threshold for a nuclear weapon. In a week during which North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, it was indeed disturbing to read that their brothers in arms in Iran are also developing comparable technology with direct application to intermediate and intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Back in 2021, in the Integrated Review, the United Kingdom asserted that with its allies, it would, and I quote, hold Iran to account for its nuclear activity. I'd be grateful if the Noble Lord the Minister could tell us when the update of the review will be completed, explain what we mean by accountability, how we intend to respond to these most recent developments, and what it meant when we say we remain, again I quote, open to talks on a more comprehensive nuclear and regional deal, not least in the context of President Biden's reported remarks that the JCPOA is dead. And in any event, my lords, why should we believe anything this regime says or promises? They told the world that their centrifuges could only enrich uranium to a 60% level of purity, as their total enrichment of uranium stockpiles now exceeds JCPOA limits by at least 18 times. It's patently clear that this is not a regime whose word counts for anything. The risks to world peace, including an existential risk to the state of Israel, are obvious. On September the 12th, Israel's Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, displayed a map depicting the Syrian location of 10 production facilities for mid- and long-range precise missiles and weapons that Iran had provided to Hezbollah and Iranian proxies. Now, in commenting on that, I hope the Minister can also tell us how we've responded to Iran's provision of unmanned aerial vehicles, Mohajer 6 drones and Shahed 131 and 136 drones, which target civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, aiding and abetting Putin's brutal war crimes, in which Iran is now implicated and complicit, and for which it should be held to account and ultimately prosecuted. As an Iranian delegation was in Moscow last month discussing the building of a factory to mass manufacture zones. Are we seized, my lords, of the urgency in recognising the deepening military and economic ties between Russia, Iran and the PRC, everything from satellites to grain to drones and to joint military exercises in the Gulf? As for the axis with Putin, it was reported in The Guardian last week, I quote, The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has been at the forefront of the growing bond, with senior leaders Khalil Mohammed-Zadeh, Suleiman Hamidi, and Ali Shamkhani playing central roles in the drone exports to Russia. In response, just how effective does the noble lord believe that more than 50 sanctions designations imposed because of military support for Putin or as a consequence of human rights have actually been? And are we considering further sanctions? And my lords, beyond sanctions, is it correct that the FCDO has blocked a Home Office attempt to prescribe the IRGC? And is that because of German reluctance to do the same? As I asked on January the 18th in the House, following the execution of Ali Reza Akbari, what has to happen? What further evidence is needed before they are prescribed? Such executions and death penalties are not new in Iran. It's long ranked amongst the world's top executioners, often on the back of hasty sham trials. In 2021, it executed 314 people, 20% more than in 2020. There are estimates that differ for 2022, but dozens are facing protests-related executions. Perhaps the noble lord can give us the FCDO estimates, including the numbers of children who have been executed. As for the sham trials and what passes for justice, Tara Seperifar of Human Rights Watch says this: defendants are systematically deprived of access to lawyers and are subjected to torture and coerced confessions, then rushed to the gallows. Not that we should be surprised, my lords, given the role of President Ibrahim Raisi in 1988 in the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, predominantly from Mrs. Rajavi's pro-democracy resistance. Executions have been used to try and frighten people who've been protesting since the death in September of 22-year-old Mahsa Jina Amini while in the custody of the nation's morality police. It was the spark that ignited a nationwide revolt against the theocratic regime, and in many cases led by young women, turning on its head the stereotypes about the nature of opposition within Iran. Mahsa had been arrested for improperly wearing her hijab, and according to her family and local media, severely beaten. She died 3 days later while still in police custody. Protests then erupted across Iran, led by women who tore off their hijabs, cut their hair, and adopted a rallying cry of women, life, freedom. How bitterly ironic that Iran, until it was expelled in December, had a place on the United Nations Women's Committee. According to the UN Office of Human Rights, protesters are facing the so-called crime of waging war against God, or Moharbe, and corruption on earth. Agnes Callamand of Amnesty International says the Iranian authorities knowingly decided to harm or kill people who took to the streets to express their anger at decades of repression and injustice. She said countless more faced being killed, maimed, tortured, sexually assaulted or thrown behind bars, and that the international community needs to go beyond mere statements of condemnation. The sheer courage is striking, my lords. Reports of what happened to Mahsa Amini emerged in part thanks to reporters Nilufar Hamedi and Elaha Mohammadi, whom the Iranian regime, of course, then subsequently jailed. These brave young women could now themselves face the death penalty, but their journalism isn't crime. By the end of 2022, there were 363 known cases of detained journalists. Article 19 is abused every day in Iran. As it tops the world's League of Executioners, Iran also tops the League of Jailing Journalists, which takes me to the BBC. I sometimes wonder whether ministers truly understand the smart power of the BBC World services. Certainly the Iranian regime must do, or they wouldn't be threatening BBC journalists and their families. Following the debate I secured on cuts to the BBC's global news services and a meeting along with Baroness Browning with the FCDO Minister David Rutley, this week I met Liliane Lander, the Director of BBC World Services. On each occasion, I've raised my concerns about the despicable treatment of BBC Persian journalists, which is of a piece with the driving out of Iran International from London. But I've also contested the shocking decision of the FCDO to cut the BBC Persian radio service. BBC services being cut does exactly what the regime wants the FCDO and the BBC to do, and in the scheme of things, it makes very small savings. I know my noble friend Lady Cousins will return to this issue. But in summary, my lords, 1.6 million Iranians still get their news via radio, and dictators can far more easily close down internet services. Long-term funding of the BBC World must be addressed, but in the short term, Persian radio services should not be allowed to close. Its voice, and the voices of those who want to see the emergence of a more just and democratic society based on the rule of law, must not be silenced. And in this debate today, we must reiterate our support and raise our voices for the people of Iran.
Yes.